In this key area, we're going to have a look at some of the problems around crop protection. So we're looking at weeds and pests and diseases that can affect plants. Now, in this first slide here, what we're looking at here is a natural ecosystem. So maybe looking here, in this case here, at a natural field. And in a natural situation like this, you've got a natural ecosystem, you've got a balance that exists between producers and consumers. There's a diverse variety of plant species that coexist with their fellow plants, insects and microorganisms. Now this diversity and genetic variety amongst the species makes them more resilient to pests and weeds and fungal infections. But when you're growing a crop which is described as a monoculture, that is a monoculture, you've only got one species of plant or crop in the area, the members of the crop are often very genetically identical or absolutely genetically identical, and weeds and pests and fungal infections have to be tightly controlled to ensure the greatest yield in the crop. If you've got a pest that's going to affect one of these plants, then it's going to affect all of them because they're all very, very similar. Same way if you've got a disease. So let's have a look, think about the sort of things that plants do compete for. Well, they'll compete for light, they'll compete for space, they'll compete for nutrients in the soil. And so in the case of a monoculture, you need to be trying to do something that is going to be reducing competition. So you could reduce competition in monocultures by growing the plants in rows, and having them nicely and evenly spaced out so they get maximum light. You got to also make sure that your soil has got good nutrients in it and things. The problem with growing plants in rows is that the gaps get filled in with weeds. Now a weed, when we talk about a weed, it's any kind of plant that grows where it's not wanted. You know, you would call something a weed if it was in the middle of your crop, but it might be if you were out in the countryside, you wouldn't describe it as a weed. It's just a plant that grows where it should be normally growing, but if we don't want it there, then we call it a weed. So the significance of weeds to agriculture is that it's going to have some sort of economic impact, and that may be it's because you get a significant reduction in the productivity of the crop because these weeds are competing. Or it may be that these weeds actually release some sort of chemical inhibitor in the soil, which further reduces the crop. There are some weeds that actually produce chemicals that stop other plants growing round about it, and that would not be ideal if you're trying to grow a crop there. It could be that the weeds themselves contaminate the grain crops with their seeds, and that reduces the value of the crop. Or these weeds themselves actually act as hosts for crop pests and other diseases. So let's have a look at some of the properties of weeds, and we're going to look first of all at one group of weeds which are called annual weeds. Now these are plants which complete their life cycle in 1 year. That is from seed to death in 1 year. And they have various features. Annual seeds produce vast numbers of seeds, and the seeds are viable for long periods of time. So down here at the bottom I've got an example of an annual weed, and that would be chickweed. And you have maybe seen this growing in places got this tiny little white flower, and it tends to cover across the ground. And these will produce lots and lots of seeds. And when the conditions are right for the growth, these seeds will grow very quickly following germination. And these annual weeds, they have a short life cycle. They'll grow up quickly, they'll produce seeds, and then they'll die back. The other type of weed we'll talk about are perennial weeds. Now perennial plants are plants which will live for several years. They'll become dormant in the winter time and they'll grow back again in the spring. So they tend to kind of maybe sort of die back a bit in the winter, and then what happens is you'll get new growth in the springtime. And perennial weeds are able to reproduce vegetatively. That is, they can reproduce asexually They have undergo sexual reproduction as well, but they can reproduce asexually. That is, they can just make little copies of themselves. They are already established in the habitat, so they have a competitive advantage. They're already there and they've been growing there for several years. Now, as well as that, they also have storage organs, that is in their roots, to provide food when conditions become poor. So I've got an example here of a dandelion, and dandelions, in fact, they've got very, very long tap roots that come right the way down from the plant. If you've ever tried to dig up a dandelion, then you'll find that those roots go right the way down. There'll be other roots off it, but the roots will act as well with perennial plants as a way of storing food in order for them to be able to survive when conditions are pretty tough. So they're pretty tough little plants and quite hard to get rid of. So that's a kind of quick resume of weeds. Let's have a look at the other sort of things that can affect crops. Well, you've got your invertebrate pests, and they can broadly fall into three main groups. You've got your worms, you've got your mollusks, that's things like slugs or snails. Slugs, my pet hate in my garden. And there are invertebrate pests, so things like aphids, that's like your green fly, or butterflies. Now the problem with the effect of invertebrate pests is that they destroy the leaves, and that reduces the plant's ability to carry out photosynthesis and therefore their ability to produce glucose, and that can result in a reduction of vigour and yield. So you can be losing money from your crop because you've got a reduction in the yield of your crop. And also as well, when we're looking at this from a food security point of view, you're reducing the yield in the crop there to be able to provide food for people. It's not just the economic disadvantages of it. The other problem as well is that some pests can also act as a vector. That is a carrier of other diseases which can damage the crop. So let's go on and have a look at what kind of diseases can damage a crop. Well, plant diseases are caused by pathogens, and these can either be bacteria or fungi or viruses, and these can be spread through the air, the soil, or by, as I said in the previous slide there, by invertebrate vectors. Now, the economic effect of plant diseases is that the plant diseases, well, they'll affect the yield of the crop, so they could actually be destroying the crop, or they could be making the crop less marketable. You know, if you have a look at these apples here with the damage on it, well, nobody's wanting to buy an apple that looks like this with this damage that's on it, even if parts of the apple might still be edible. If they're blemished, then they're not worth any money, or it might be that they degrade too quickly during storage or something like that. So all of these things have an economic impact and also an impact on yield on the crop. So what can we do about some of these problems? Well, when we're looking at controlling, we're going to have a look first of all at controlling weeds, pests and diseases. Well, we're going to have a look first of all at different ways that we can do this. It can be done by cultural means or by chemical means, and we can control weeds, pests and diseases first of all by this one here, by cultural means. Now these are techniques for controlling these things which are non-chemical. They've been developed over a long period at a time, some really by trial and error. And a first example we're going to have a look at cultural methods of crop protection would be ploughing. That is by turning over the top 20 centimetres of soil, roughly, every time a field is ploughed. Many weeds get buried deep enough for them to actually die down and decompose. Obviously as well, weeding, so removing the weeds, if that's done early in the life of the crop, then the crop gets a chance to grow up and it's there before the weeds are, and that means that it's reducing competition. Now, weeds are also removed from the edges of a field because they're going to provide a breeding ground for pathogens. And there are different ways of doing this. You'll see this here. These are people who are actually removing weeds in a field by hand, or it can be that certain tractors will actually work up and down the lines to actually remove weeds as they're going along from between the rows of plants. Another cultural means is this crop rotation, which has been going on for centuries, which is really a case of you're growing different crops one after the other on the same piece of ground over 4 growing seasons. So for example, in year 1 you would have this kind of setup that's here with your potatoes in field 1, cabbage field 2 and so on. But then the following year, in year 2, you would move your potatoes to the cabbage field, you'd move your cabbage to the peas to the onions, and the onions to the potato field. And the advantage to this is that pathogens in the soil from the first crop that's here, can it be grown on the second crop? What I mean by that is if you've got some sort of pathogen that affects potatoes in field 1 in the first year, then by moving the onions to there, then it's not going to be a problem because it doesn't affect onions. And in the same way, if you've got onion fly in this field and you've moved your onions to here, then it's not a problem because you're now growing peas in this field and so on. The other advantage is that you maybe, for example, are growing peas in a field and they have got nitrogen fixing bacteria in the roots. We'll talk about that later on in the course. But that adds nutrients to the soil, and then you grow your peas the following year in the next field, and then the following year you grow them in the next field. So you're always adding nutrients to the soil as you're going along. So these are cultural means, but what if that isn't enough? Well, there's chemical means of crop protection, and the first kind that we're going to have a look at are herbicides. There's also as well pesticides and fungicides, and we'll go on to look at them. But first of all, looking at herbicides. Now, herbicides can either be what are known as selective, systemic or contact. We'll look at the difference from these. Now, a selective herbicide, what it does is it actually mimics the action of certain growth hormones. And what it does is it speeds up the growth or the metabolism of the plant, and it works on broadleaf plants. So if you've got a broadleaf plant, by that I mean a plant that maybe grows along the ground like this kind of thing, and its leaves are spread out across the ground. The dandelion that we saw earlier was an example. And you've got a cereal crop which looks like this. You saw that at the very beginning with the monoculture. Well, the herbicide is going to end up on those leaves, and what actually happens is the leaves are, this metabolism speeds up, the food reserves are used up, and the plant actually dies. It dies from, I suppose you could say, exhaustion. But that's because the herbicide has ended up on these on these leaves that are spread out over the ground. But if you've got a narrow plant, then they're not affected. They don't take up that herbicide, or that herbicide isn't on the leaves to the same extent. You've also got systemic herbicides, and they're absorbed by the plant, and they're transported to all areas of the plant. And that's got a lethal effect on the leaves and the roots of the plant. You can also use contact herbicides. Now, these are herbicides that they kill all the green plant tissue they come in contact with, but they're not actually systemic, so they don't spread throughout the plant. The roots survive and the plants can regrow, so they're just killing off the leaves that the herbicides come in contact with. You can use pesticides to control your pests, and I've got here without the use of pesticides, about a third of crops would be lost due to invertebrate attack. And there are 2 types of pesticides. There's contact and systemic. Now, the contact pesticides, they work in 2 ways. They kill the invertebrates when they're actually sprayed. So you're the farmer, and here you see them spraying here, and if there's any pests there, they're going to kill the invertebrates. But they also leave a protective residue on the plant which kills off future invertebrates. Or you've got systemic pesticides, and what happens is they are absorbed by the plant, but they only kill any invertebrates which then eat the plant. So you're not, say, if you're using a contact pesticide, for example, you could be killing off good invertebrates, but which aren't actually eating the leaves of the plant, but they're there and they're pollinating and so on. If you use a systemic one, then you're only killing off invertebrates that are actually eating your plant material. Fungicides are used to kill off fungal parasites which cause diseases in crop plants, and again these can be contact or systemic. And contact fungicides are sprayed on crops and they are absorbed by fungal spores when they start to germinate, and that causes the fungus to die. The thing is, contact fungicides are easily washed away by the rain, so they have to be reapplied to crops quite regularly. Systemic fungicides, they are absorbed by the plant and they're not washed away by the rain. But they'll only kill the fungi that are actually affecting the crop plant. So they're not killing off every fungi that is around. So I've put together just a wee sort of mind map here of our control of pests, our looking at our cultural and our chemical means.